Back to another video. Purple Political Talk here. Today is Monday, May 27th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about how Donald Trump can win the election in a landslide. In other words, we're going to be taking a look at Donald Trump's best case scenarios in a lot of different scenarios, which we're going to be talking about. But before we do begin this video, I want to remind you to like, subscribe, and to turn on the notification bell so you're up to date with all of our latest content. Without further ado, let's get started with the video. So, when I say best case scenarios, we're going to look at everything from what the electoral map is probably looking like right now for Donald Trump, and then do a sliding best case of how things would change as things get progressively better for Donald Trump, in a hypothetical best case scenario. So on your screen right now, you can see the states, the current electoral map based on some of the most recent polls and some of my predictions, right? So when you look at this map, you see that Donald Trump is a very strong holding down in the Sun Belt right now, and that is his area of strength. And frankly, I would say as of right now, Donald Trump is leading the election. He's a leading candidate, as seen by the electoral characterization. So off the bat, if you were to look at a moderately good scenario for Donald Trump, he would be winning the election. Now, let's say Donald Trump has a good night during the 2024 election. What happens for him? Well, he wins the election. That's the first thing. But what are some of the first states to flip? I think honestly, states in a good night, a state like Michigan could flip, and then you have other like his tilt states, maybe Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. They shift by a couple of points. Maybe they would have gone by one right now. Right now, I think they go by around 1 or 2 points. Maybe they go by 2.5 points, 3, putting them into the lean column, right? And then on a good night for Donald Trump, I think the state of Minnesota gets a lot closer. Pretty much everything else, though, I think sort of stays the same. Now, moving into a, very good night for Trump. Let's say you're starting to get into the landslide territory. On a very good night for Trump, I think he wins the state of Minnesota, ever so slightly, but a win nonetheless. And on a very good night, I think he also starts getting closer in some states like New York. I don't think he's going to win in New York. I don't think he's going to win in New Jersey. But I think, those characterizations, they come down a little bit. And I think, once you start getting into a world where Donald Trump is winning in somewhere like Minnesota, I think places like Nevada might end up going by likely margins. Again, I think this is, and based on the current polling, this is something that certainly could happen. I think Trump has been leading by around 5 or 6 points consistently. Let's say that, in a very good night for Donald Trump, he could easily, meet that. I currently do think, in part, the polls are overestimating Donald Trump to a certain extent, especially with, the big chunk of undecided voters. But at the end of the day, if those undecided voters break for Donald Trump, places like Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, maybe even North Carolina could be going by likely margins, and places that before were kind of in that 10-point range, like Ohio and Florida, I could see Ohio going back into the safe column on a very good night for Donald Trump, maybe even Texas, right? Florida, I still see getting closer to the 15%. I don't think in like an absolute best case scenario for Donald Trump, Florida ends up, going by a safe margin. I still think that there is, enough voters for the Democrats there to keep it in a likely margin for the Republican Party. So when we look at that, I think this is sort of where you start seeing kind of all the states. Now, where else do I think things change in a better scenario for Donald Trump? I think in reality, and this is starting getting into the situations where Donald Trump has a very strong night. I think he can close down those margins in Colorado, close down those margins in New Mexico. And we're talking here in somewhat landslide territory. And your definition of a landslide, for me, really, in modern politics, I think a landslide is really anything above 320 electoral votes. Frankly, because it is kind of hard to achieve. For Trump to reach 320 electoral votes, he would essentially have to carry the state of Minnesota along with the rest of the Rust Belt, the rest of the Sun Belt, right? And I think that's a really big ask in today's political environment. And one of the things that we're going to realize is every year there are going to be less and less states that are close, right? There's going to be less and less swing states. And you could even see that with the Senate elections map that, there is a lot of less states that are kind of that close competitiveness. So, I think something like this could be what I would say realistically a really, relatively good night for Donald Trump. Looks like I think this is kind of the most realistic best case scenario. Now, what happens, and well, with that, I also think the state of New Hampshire goes down into, oh, it was already in the lean column, goes into the lean column. Now, this again is what I think a realistic best case scenario looks for Donald Trump in the 2024 election. Now, what does like an absolute best case scenario look for him? Well, I think an absolute best case scenario, this is already getting into the plane of the unrealistic. I've talked about this, briefly when I did my Biden video, that I don't really think that maybe not even this is going to be the electoral map, but what I'm about to say now, I think even less. I think this would be, an absolute best case scenario where you see Donald Trump, for example, he would carry, I would say, the second district, Nebraska. Margins in Maine's second district might go into the likely column. In an absolute best case scenario, I think he can narrowly carry the state of New Hampshire. And then I think really that's where Donald Trump's limits go. As far as like an absolute, like by far best case scenario, more unrealistically, I think, states like Colorado would go down a bit in margins. A state like Virginia could get really close. And again, this is a really best case, getting into the unrealistic. I honestly think that if you were to ask me, what does Donald Trump's most realistic best case scenario look like? I would tell you probably take away Nebraska's second district and take away New Hampshire. Pretty much everything else is really possible. I think Donald Trump can easily win down in the Sun Belt. I don't think there's really a question about that. Donald Trump's degree of success in the 2024 election is going to come down to the Rust Belt. Whether or not he's able to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that's going to be, the first test in saying, is Donald Trump going to become president? He needs to win at least two of these Rust Belt states in order to win the election. And then you would add on to that the possibility of Minnesota. There's been some really close polls in Minnesota, so in a best case scenario, I definitely think it's a possibility that Donald Trump carries that. But I do want to hear what you think down in the comments below. What do you think Donald Trump's best case scenario looks like in the 2024 presidential election? Do you think he can win the entire Rust Belt, for example, in a best case scenario if he has a good night? What do you think a good night for Donald Trump looks like? What do you think an extremely good night for Donald Trump looks like? And what do you think is the absolutely best case scenario that he can have in this election? Honestly, Donald Trump, depending on how a lot of things end up turning out, when it comes to a lot of these cases, when it comes to, the economy, and it comes to Biden's popularity, getting closer to election day, if he is able to win over independents, I think a scenario like this is possible. Maybe not in New Hampshire, right? Because again, we said that was a bit in the unrealistic, plane of events. But winning Minnesota, winning Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and the entire Sun Belt is something that's realistic for Donald Trump if he can win over those independents. Right now, he is ahead, and that's really going to be the determining factor for the election, whether or not he can win those independents. But I want to thank you guys so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a huge thumbs up. Remember to like, subscribe, and to turn on the notification bell to be up to date with our latest 2024 election content. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.